The Americans. Chapter 24, World War Looms. Section 1, Dictators Threaten World Peace. Martha Gellhorn arrived in Madrid in 1937 to cover the brutal civil war that had broken out in Spain the year before. Hired as a special correspondent for Collier's Weekly, she had come with very little money and no special protection. On assignment there, she met the writer Ernest Hemingway, whom she later married. To Gellhorn, a young American writer, the Spanish Civil War was a deadly struggle between tyranny and democracy. For the people of Madrid, it was also a daily struggle for survival. A personal voice, Martha Gellhorn. You would be walking down a street, hearing only the city noises and streetcars and automobiles and people calling to one another, and suddenly, crushing it all out, would be the huge, stony, deep booming of a falling shell. At the corner, there was no place to run, because how did you know what the next shell would not be behind you, or ahead, or to the left or right? Less than 2 decades after the end of World War I, the war to end all wars, fighting erupted again in Europe and in Asia. As Americans read about distant battles, they hoped the conflicts would remain on the other side of the world. Part 1. Nationalism grips Europe and Asia. The seeds of new conflicts had been sown in World War I. For many nations, peace had brought not prosperity, but revolution fueled by economic depression and struggle. The post-war years also brought the rise of powerful dictators driven by the belief in nationalism, loyalty to one's country above all else, and dreams of territorial expansion. Failures of the World War I peace settlement. Instead of securing a just and secure peace, the Treaty of Versailles caused anger and resentment. Germans saw nothing fair in the treaty that blamed them for starting the war. Nor did they find security in a settlement that stripped them of their overseas colonies and border territories. These problems overwhelmed the Weimar Republic, the democratic government set up in Germany after World War I. Similarly, the Soviets resented the carving up of parts of Russia. See map in Chapter 19, page 606. The peace settlement had not fulfilled President Wilson's hope of a world safe for democracy. New democratic governments that emerged in Europe after the war floundered. Without a democratic tradition, people turned to authoritarian leaders to solve their economic and social problems. The new democracies collapsed, and dictators were able to seize power. Some had great ambitions. Joseph Stalin transforms the Soviet Union. In Russia, hopes for democracy gave way to civil war, resulting in the establishment of a communist state, officially called the Soviet Union, in 1922. After Vladimir Ilyich Lenin died in 1924, Joseph Stalin, whose last name means man of steel, took control of the country. Stalin focused on creating a model communist state. In so doing, he made both agriculture and industrial growth the prime economic goals of the Soviet Union. Stalin abolished all privately owned farms and replaced them with collectives, large government-owned farms, each worked by hundreds of families. Stalin moved to transform the Soviet Union from a backward rural nation into a great industrial power. In 1928, the Soviet dictator outlined the first of several 5-year plans to direct the industrialization. All economic activity was placed under state management. By 1937, the Soviet Union had become the world's second-largest industrial power, surpassed in overall production only by the United States. The human costs of this transformation, however, were enormous. In his drive to purge or eliminate anyone who threatened his power, Stalin did not spare even his most faithful supporters. While the final toll will never be known, historians estimate that Stalin was responsible for the deaths of 8 million to 13 million people. Millions more died in famines caused by the restructuring of Soviet society. By 1939, Stalin had firmly established a totalitarian government that tried to exert complete control over its citizens. In a totalitarian state, individuals have no rights, and the government suppresses all opposition. The rise of fascism in Italy. While Stalin was consolidating his power in the Soviet Union, Benito Mussolini was establishing a totalitarian regime in Italy, where unemployment and inflation produced bitter strikes, some of which were communist-led. Alarmed by these threats, the middle and upper classes demanded stronger leadership. Mussolini took advantage of the situation. A powerful speaker, Mussolini knew how to appeal to Italy's wounded national pride. He played on the fears of economic collapse and communism. In this way, he won the support of many discontented Italians. By 1921, Mussolini had established the Fascist Party. Fascism stressed nationalism and placed the interests of the state above those of individuals. To strengthen the nation, fascists argued power must rest with a single strong leader and a small group of devoted party members. The Latin fasces, a bundle of rods tied around an axe handle, had been a symbol of unity and authority in ancient Rome. In October 1922, Mussolini marched on Rome with thousands of his followers, whose black uniforms gave them the name Black Shirts. When important government officials, the army, and the police sided with the fascists, the Italian king appointed Mussolini head of the government. Calling himself Il Duce, or the leader, Mussolini gradually extended fascist control over every aspect of Italian life. Tourists marveled that Il Duce had even made the trains run on time. Mussolini achieved this efficiency, however, by crushing all opposition, by making Italy a totalitarian state. The Nazis take over Germany. In Germany, Adolf Hitler had followed a path to power similar to Mussolini's. At the end of World War I, Hitler had been a jobless soldier drifting around Germany. In 1919, he joined a struggling group called the National Socialist German Workers' Party, better known as the Nazi Party. Despite its name, the party had no ties to socialism. Hitler proved to be such a powerful public speaker and organizer that he quickly became the party's leader. Calling himself Der Führer, the leader, he promised to bring Germany out of chaos. In his book Mein Kampf, or My Struggle, Hitler set forth the basic beliefs of Nazism that became the plan for action for the Nazi Party. Nazism, the German brand of fascism, was based on extreme nationalism. Hitler, who had been born in Austria, dreamed of uniting all German-speaking peoples in a great German empire. Hitler also wanted to enforce racial purification at home. In his view, Germans, especially blue-eyed, blonde-haired Aryans, formed a master race that was designed to rule the world. Inferior races, such as Jews, Slavs, and all non-whites, were deemed fit only to serve the Aryans. The third element of Nazism was national expansion. Hitler believed that for Germany to thrive, it needed more Lebensraum, or living space. One of the Nazis' aims, as Hitler wrote in Mein Kampf, was to secure for the German people the land and soil to which they are entitled on this earth. Even if this could be accomplished only by the might of a victorious sword. The Great Depression helped the Nazis come to power. Because of war debts and dependence on American loans and investments, Germany's economy was hit hard. By 1932, some 6 million Germans were unemployed. Many men who were out of work joined Hitler's private army, the stormtroopers or brown shirts. The German people were desperate and turned to Hitler as their last hope. By mid-1932, the Nazis became the strongest political party in Germany. In January 1933, Hitler was appointed Chancellor, or Prime Minister. Once in power, Hitler quickly dismantled Germany's democratic Weimar Republic. In its place, he established the Third Reich, or the Third German Empire. According to Hitler, the Third Reich would be a 1,000-year Reich. It would last for 1,000 years. According to Hitler. Militarists gained control in Japan. Halfway around the world, nationalistic military leaders were trying to take control of the imperial government of Japan. These leaders shared in common with Hitler a belief in the need for more living space for a growing population. Ignoring the protests of more moderate Japanese officials, the militarists launched a surprise attack and seized control of the Chinese province of Manchuria in 1931. Within several months, Japanese troops controlled the entire province, a large region about twice the size of Texas, that was rich in natural resources. The watchful League of Nations had been established after World War I to prevent just such aggressive acts. In this greatest test of the League's power, representatives were sent to Manchuria to investigate the situation. Their report condemned Japan, who in turn simply quit the League. Meanwhile, the success of the Manchurian invasion put the militarists firmly in control of Japan's government. Aggression in Europe and Africa. The failure of the League of Nations to take action against Japan did not escape the notice of Europe's dictators. In 1933, Hitler pulled Germany out of the League. In 1935, he began a military buildup in violation of the Treaty of Versailles. A year later, he sent troops into the Rhineland, a German region bordering France and Belgium, that was demilitarized as a result of the Treaty of Versailles. The League did nothing to stop Hitler. Meanwhile, Mussolini began building his new Roman Empire. The first target was Ethiopia, one of Africa's few remaining independent countries. By the fall of 1935, tens of thousands of Italian soldiers stood ready to advance on Ethiopia. The League of Nations reacted with brave talk of collective resistance to all acts of unprovoked aggression. When the invasion began, however, the League's response was an ineffective economic boycott, little more than a slap on Italy's wrist. By May 1936, Ethiopia had fallen. In desperation, Haile Selassie, the ousted Ethiopian emperor, appealed to the League for assistance. Nothing was done. "It is us today," he told them. "It will be you tomorrow." The Civil War breaks out in Spain. In 1936, a group of Spanish army officers, led by General Francisco Franco, rebelled against the Spanish Republic. Revolts broke out all over Spain, and the Spanish Civil War began. The war aroused passions not only in Spain but throughout the world. About 3,000 Americans formed the Abraham Lincoln Battalion and traveled to Spain to fight against Franco. We just knew, recalled Martha Gellhorn, that Spain was the place to stop fascism. Among the volunteers were African Americans still bitter about Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia the year before. Such limited aid was not sufficient to stop the spread of fascism, however. The Western democracies remained neutral. Although the Soviet Union sent equipment and advisors, Hitler and Mussolini backed Franco's forces with troops, weapons, tanks, and fighter planes. The war forged a close relationship between German and Italian dictators, who signed a formal alliance known as the Rome-Berlin Axis. After a loss of almost 500,000 lives, Franco's victory in 1939 established him as Spain's fascist dictator. Once again, a totalitarian government ruled in Europe. Part 2. The United States responds cautiously. Most Americans were alarmed by the international conflicts in the mid-1930s, but believed that the United States should not get involved. In 1928, the United States had signed the Kellogg-Briand Pact. The treaty was signed by 62 countries and declared that war would not be used as an instrument of national policy. Yet it did not include a plan to deal with countries that broke their pledge. The pact was, therefore, only a small step towards peace. Americans cling to isolationism. In the early 1930s, a flood of books argued that the United States had been dragged into World War I by greedy bankers and arms dealers. Public outrage led to the creation of a congressional committee chaired by North Dakota Senator Gerald Nye that held hearings on those charges. The Nye Committee fueled the controversy by documenting the large profits that banks and manufacturers had made during the war. As the furor grew over these merchants of death, Americans became more determined than ever to avoid war. Anti-war feeling was so strong that the Girl Scouts of America changed the color of its uniform from khaki to green to appear less militaristic. Americans' growing isolationism eventually had an impact on President Roosevelt's foreign policy. When he had first taken office in 1933, Roosevelt felt comfortable reaching out to the world in several ways. He officially recognized the Soviet Union in 1933 and agreed to exchange ambassadors with Moscow. He continued the policy of non-intervention in Latin America begun by Presidents Coolidge and Hoover with his good neighbor policy and withdrew armed forces stationed there. In 1934, Roosevelt pushed the Reciprocal Trade Agreement Act through Congress. This act lowered trade barriers by giving the president the power to make trade agreements with other nations that was aimed at reducing tariffs by as much as 50%. In an effort to keep the United States out of future wars, beginning in 1935, Congress passed a series of neutrality acts. The first two acts outlawed arms sales or loans to nations at war. The third act was passed in response to the fighting in Spain. This act extended the ban on arms sales and loans to nations engaged in civil wars. Neutrality breaks down. Despite congressional efforts to legislate neutrality, Roosevelt found it impossible to remain neutral. When Japan launched a new attack on China in July 1937, Roosevelt found a way around the neutrality acts. Because Japan had not formally declared war against China, the president claimed there was no need to enforce the neutrality acts. The United States continued sending arms and supplies to China. A few months later, Roosevelt spoke out strongly against isolationism in a speech delivered in Chicago. He called on peace-loving nations to quarantine or isolate aggressor nations in order to stop the spread of war. A personal voice, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The peace, the freedom, the security of 90% of the population of the world is being jeopardized by the remaining 10% who are threatening a breakdown of all international order and law. Surely the 90% who want to live in peace under law and in accordance with moral standards that have received almost universal acceptance through the centuries can and must find some way to preserve peace. At last, Roosevelt seemed ready to take a stand against aggression. That is, until isolationist newspapers exploded in protest, accusing the president of leading the nation into war. Roosevelt backed off in the face of criticism. But his speech did begin to shift the debate. For the moment, the conflicts remained over there.